As mentioned, my name's Ed Meyer. I'm representing Zane Grey's West Society, a nonprofit organization that encourages people to read Zane Grey's novels. Where we've been talking about a lot of wonderful science, I'll be talking about a lot of fiction, otherwise known as fake news. How many of you have never read a Zane Grey novel? Oh, that's delightful. That's delightful. That's what we hope. The founder of Zane Grey's West Society 40 years ago, Dr. Joseph Wheeler, wrote a brief description of Zane Grey. And think about how significant this is, because he was the most published author in the world between 1900 and 1950. In 57 novels, 10 books of Western nonfiction, and 130 movies, Zane Grey almost single-handedly created the myth of the West. His respectful treatment of Indians was ahead of its time. His word paintings of some of the world's most spectacular country may never be equaled. Keep in mind, there was no television. Movies were in their infancy in the later part of his career. The McGruffy readers and the Bible are the only publications that sold more than his works. Now, we know that Zane Grey visited the Colorado Plateau at least 30 times to research his works. The picture on the left on the horse is in Flagstaff for the first movie, I think, might have been the second, of Riders of the Purple Sage. The picture on the right is of Nas de Begay meeting his scout and guide that took him into Rainbow Bridge. I can't talk about 30 locations on the Colorado Plateau today, so we're going to narrow it a lot. We're going to simply talk about the places that Zane Grey visited and the people that he met in 1907 and 1908. This is a picture of Zane Grey in the Grand Canyon in 1907, I believe, at a spring getting a drink of water. So let's talk about how this began. The lady in the picture is Zane Grey's wife, Dolly, Lisa Roth, actually, Lisa Dolly Roth. She was a college student studying to become a school teacher, really into writing, and that was very useful to Zane Grey because he was a terrible writer at the beginning. They were married in the fall of 1905. In January of 1906, they went on their honeymoon, and they stopped at the south rim of the Grand Canyon and stayed at El Tovar. I believe that was the second year that El Tovar was around, so very early. They also traveled with mules down to the river, and this is a postcard that Zane Grey sent home to his brother saying, boy, it'd sure be tough hiking around this point. His career turned around in New York City when he met a gentleman named Buffalo Jones. Buffalo Jones had killed, probably 1,000 buffalo on the Great Plains, and he wanted to repent. And his idea of repenting was to do a cross-breeding project of Galloway cattle and bison. And he went back east to do talks in New York to encourage people to donate toward that effort. And he wasn't talking as much about the bison as he was about his adventures roping mountain lions. And you have a picture of him roping a mountain lion on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And he roped them for zoos and private collections. But the people back there laughed at him. They said, you can't rope a mountain lion. But there was one person who agreed with him that it might happen. So Zane Grey went to his hotel room and said, could I go with you? I'm a great photographer, which, by the way, he wasn't. But he said he's a great photographer, and I'm a published writer. Well, he had pretty much self-funded his publications, but he did have a book. And so they headed west. And that was in April of 1907. Zane Grey eventually wrote a book, and it's a great book as a research item for you because it's nonfiction, called The Last of the Plainsmen. And you need to get one of the first two editions because they have all kinds of photographs of that area in that time and that day. The first place they went to was El Tovar, and on March 29th, 1907, they met Dave Rust. Dave Rust, of course, was a guide and educator, a journalist, but at the time he was building the cable and the tram that went across the Colorado River. And their intent had been to go down and across the tram and up to the North Rim. But Dave Rust reported that the Bright Angel Creek was running too high and the snow was too deep. Then that they'd have to come back a couple of weeks later and go to Flagstaff and cross the Painted Desert and go up in that manner. So they did, and they came back, and there was a gentleman named Jim Emett who was supposed to be someone they might cross the Painted Desert with. Jim Emett had been the town marshal here in Kanab, and he was called on a Mormon, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints mission to operate Lee's Ferry, and that mission lasted, I believe, like 12 years. So it was a very long mission. But Buffalo Jones writes, "Come to the courthouse. Emmett's on trial for rustling. The trial won't last long. Emett has powerful friends here." And in fact, the people that were accusing him, their witnesses didn't show up. What happened to them, we really don't know. But they didn't show up, and Emett had a whole host of witnesses, and he and his son, who was on trial with him, were quickly acquitted. Now, a little bit about Emett and how Zane Grey felt about Jim Emett. And this is Jim Emett going down one of the trails up there. You folks may know better than me. But Emett was good. He typified all that was rugged, splendid, and enduring. He was an old Viking of the desert. I had to revere him. I had to love him. And so let's go across the Painted Desert with Zane Grey. One of our associates came up with this. These are the people who were subpoenaed to be witnesses on behalf of Zane Grey. And we've pretty much identified, obviously we know who they were, but what happened is that they had come across the Painted Desert, most likely, with Jim Emett, testified on his behalf, and returned because they were all from southern Utah, and that's the route they would have come. One thing, when Jim Emett, he camped right where, if you leave Flagstaff and right where the trees stop and you can look out across the Painted Desert, that's where they camped. And he wrote a letter to his wife. And he said, "You ought to see this crowd of Mormons I'm going with. If they aren't a tough bunch, I've never seen one. They all pack guns, but they're nice people." And so that was the night before they headed out, April 12th, 1907. So let's talk about who was in that wagon train with Zane Grey. The first three people are freighters of one type or another. The gentleman on the left owned a timber company up in Panguitch. And so he would haul timber back and forth. The next gentleman owned a freight company out of Sevier County. And Sevier County was important because that's where Marysville is where the railroad line stopped. And so you freighted all of your supplies south from there, or a lot of them, of course. There were other ways. So this gentleman owned a freight company, and Mr. Nebeker next to him was a teamster. So they were driving wagons, and because they were really gone for a month or so, you can assure that they took a product with them to sell in Flagstaff, and then they returned home, which is why we had a wagon train going across the desert instead of horses and buggies. The gentleman on the right is Dave Ryder, who was a friend of Jim Emmett's, and testified that Jim Emett was not where the proposed rustling occurred at the time. We also had a couple ladies. The lady in the middle is Jim Emmett's wife, Emma. The people to the left are her brother and sister. The gentleman on the far right is Jim Emmett's son, William Snap Emett. This is Snap much later than his wife. He was a gunman, a drinker, a pretty tough character, actually. And then there were two other members that are important, and these were church officials, LDS Mormon church officials, who had testified on Jim Emmett's behalf. By the way, whether they testified truthfully or not is another thing, but they certainly got him acquitted. The gentleman on the right in this picture is Asa Judd. He was the Mormon bishop in Fredonia, Arizona, which is where Jim Emmett's parents lived. The gentleman on the left, and very important, is E.D. Woolley Jr. He was the stake president. He was the gentleman over all of the region along the Arizona Strip, basically, including Lee's Ferry. And one thing, well, he had an argument with these people, most likely about polygamy. And he wrote in his journal, my gosh, I'm not going to talk much more on this trip. They were pretty tough on him. However, E.D. Woolley said to Zane Grey, or Zane Grey wrote to his wife, Mr. Woolley wants me to go to Kanab to study the Mormons. He has 2 families and 15 handsome unmarried girls. Zane Grey was very attracted by handsome unmarried girls, both before and after his marriage. This is an unpublished photo. The gentleman on the left is Buffalo Jones. When you blow it up, you can tell it's Buffalo Jones. The lady on the right is probably Jim Emmett's wife, because she actually operated the ferry often, and she probably would have been one of the first ones across. This is at the bottom of the grade, and you can't see it, maybe you can see it. The old fort is right across the river, so they're about, 1,200 feet. Maybe it's 1,200 yards, I'm not sure, from where the ferry actually crossed. But that's an unpublished photo that we found at Brigham Young University. Now let's talk a little bit about Lonely Dell. Lonely Dell was Jim Emmett's ranch. And you may have seen this picture in the past. That's a picture of Lonely Dell. His home would have been up in the trees, closer to the river, and you can see that there was not much control of the river at that time over on your left side. He wrote that this is an oasis full of wheat fields, fruit trees, and flowers, and everything else, so he was very impressed. This is a picture of Jim Emmett's family, or at least part of the family, in front of a wooden house built by the Johnson family, actually, that burned after he left. However, you can see there that he had a large family. Emmett's next to him, and his children are all over to the left. Zane Grey talks about him having 2 wives when he was there. Well, that's not true. One of those little girls is the daughter of his younger wife, who had gotten into a fight a few years before Zane Grey came, and Zane Grey had sent her back to her family in the colonies in Mexico. They weren't divorced. There's some indication that he went down there because they had at least one additional child, but the Jim Emett required that he leave one of the children with him. So the daughter, Rosenell, stayed with him. Oh, I should mention on that house, no, I'll probably mention it later, but eventually he stayed in that house for a period of time writing, and he was very impressed. An article we just transcribed is the original handwritten document for The Man Who Influenced Me Most, which is about Jim Emett, in American Magazine. The what's really interesting is the transcription includes much information that was never published. Perhaps the most important, this is not a picture of the young lady. I just found a lady with a bonnet and thought a picture would be nice. I mentioned Snap Emett, that he was kind of a tough character. He had, at one point, he was a polygamist as well, but his first wife and he divorced. And this young lady was his second wife. Zane Grey wrote that that he had seen this young lady, and she was the only one really wearing a bonnet, and she always looked down, and he couldn't see her eyes. So he flipped up the bonnet to look at her and found a lovely young teenage girl. A teenage girl? You like teenage girls? But Buffalo Jones saw him do that. And he said, "Be careful, young man. That girl's Snap Emmett's new wife. She's unhappy here, and Snap's father is going to send her home. But it wouldn't do for Snap to see you flirting with her. Like as not, he'd throw a gun on you." Well, Snap Emett, as we'll see, became an inspiration for Snap Nab in Zane Grey's first Western romance, Heritage of the Desert. And Zane Grey backed away and didn't say anything, but as they left Lee's Ferry, he was in the back of a buckboard. Buffalo Jones and Jim Emett were up front arguing religion, and there was a young lady with him, and it was this young girl. And he ended up, after some time, because she was very shy, talking to her, and she talked about how bad it had been, how Snap Emett had been an abusive husband, but her biggest concern was that Snap Emett had required that their son, their only child at that time, be left behind, and she was just devastated by that. But she said that Father Emett had promised that he would bring the child later. What becomes very interesting there is that when you read Heritage of the Desert, the heroine, a young lady named Mescal, is going to be married to Snap Nab, obviously influenced by Snap Emett. And a lot of the story is about her not marrying Snap Nab. And we've never previously really known who the inspiration for that character may have been. This new passage that we've only found in the last month certainly suggests that this young lady influenced Zane Grey in that novel. This is a real picture of the young lady. We know now that her name was Katie Maud Dodge Emmett. She's over 90 here, so I thought the girl in the bonnet was a good place to start. Now let's go up on the North Rim and lasso some cougars. The green area here from Kanab Creek down to the North Bass Trail, he hunted lions up pretty much that entire area. Yeah, he also hunted lions up on the Kaibab Plateau, and he had some success. He actually shot a cougar that may be called Old Tom, who might be the biggest cougar they ever had up there. But they had some success. They lassoed some lions. They didn't have much success, though, because the lions would they wouldn't eat, they wouldn't drink, they'd basically just die. I believe they only got one lion out on that trip. Who was up there with him? Well, of course, Zane Grey was there. Of course, Buffalo Jones was there. Now, you've had presentations about Jimmy Owens. Jimmy Owens would guide people in, and since he was the game warden under the pay of the governor at that time for the Grand Canyon Forest Preserve, he typically didn't charge anything. He said, I'm getting paid by the government, so I'm not going to do anything. But he was certainly an influence. The next gentleman is Grant Wallace. Grant Wallace was a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. What was happening here is that I mentioned before E.D. Woolley, who was the main religious leader. He was covetous of what was happening on the South Rim. So he was trying to bring in people that would promote doing something like that on the North Rim. And this Grant Wallace was a known reporter. He later became an occultist, studying the occult, and got out of writing about the outdoors. But he was interesting. This next picture is another fake picture. I actually do have a picture of this gentleman. I just didn't realize it. Frank Onstott was from Texas. He had come north, as had Jimmy Owens, to the Goodnight Ranch and spent there for a while, and then he was actually the manager of the Catalog project for Buffalo Jones. And they met some people while they were up there. And these 5 people, one way or the other, were wild horse hunters. The first gentleman, Lawson or Larson, there's some confusion over what the correct spelling was, actually signed on to be their wrangler on the 1907 trip. The 2 Stewart brothers are in at least 5 other of Zane Grey's novels. They inspired, wherever you find 2 brothers who are wild horse hunters, that was inspired by these 2 gentlemen. They actually led Zane Grey and Buffalo Jones on a trip down Snake Gulch to try to capture a white Mustang who had been a real nuisance to people. And they drove them up from Kanab Creek, closed them off behind them. They had a barrier at a narrow canyon above, And they had him. They actually reached out and touched him, but he wasn't shod, and he actually climbed the cliff to get away, straight up a cliff. These other two gentlemen, Clark and Ether Wood, who was his helper from Grafton, weren't part of the party, but they were traveling the same direction. So they witnessed some of the things that Zane Grey claimed, including this large lion that he said that he had shot was stretched out between two trees. So they reported that when they came back out of the Grand Canyon, where they'd gone to retrieve some wild horses that they had down there. What are some of the places he went? They went to Oak Springs. This is a cabin that was there until about 1972 when the Forest Service destroyed it. Zane Grey stayed on a wooden platform in that cabin. That's where Buffalo Jones had some unique ways to train dogs. The concern he had is that they're going to go after cougars, and there are also deer all over the place. So are these dogs going to take off after the deer? And yes, they were. So they were 5 days training the dogs, and they take them out, and as soon as a dog headed out after a deer, he would take a small load of buckshot and shoot them to teach them that, no, that isn't where you go. So, and as I mentioned, they went down Snake Gulch. Zane Grey actually in The Last of the Plainsmen, which I mentioned, has sketches of the drawings, of the old drawings there. They camped at the head of Crazy Jug Canyon. They also went under Crazy Jug Point. So we know that they were there. We know that they dropped into Thunder River. There's a chapter in Heritage of the Desert called the Thunder River. This cabin here was not there then. That was actually where they think Jimmy Owens camped on the Moab Saddle. They think that's where he had his hunting camp. But they camped there that year. To the right of this picture is the Powell Plateau. And they did a lot of hunting, a whole lot of hunting for cougars on the Colorado Plateau. And then I mentioned he shot Old Tom. Well, this picture on the right is out towards Sowet's Point, which is a very rocky area. And that's where he reports, he called it the Siwash, but that's where he reports that he shot the lion, which was, they had cornered the lion, and the lion basically attacked Buffalo Jones, and he shot the lion to save Buffalo Jones. This is a unique picture. In the novels, the picture shows the buffalo, but it does not show Zane Grey on the white horse. And it's chopped off. And this is the original photo, which we found. And Zane Grey, well, I'll read. He said, he, Jones, took my camera and instructed me to go on ahead in the rear of the herd. I heard the click of the instrument as he snapped a picture, and then suddenly heard him shout in alarm, look out, and pull your horse. Thundering herd, hoofbeats, pounded the earth, accompanied his words. I saw a big bull with head down, tail raised, charging my horse. And that big bull right in front of him looks like it's turning his head, getting ready to charge him. They stopped at Jacob's Pool. Jacob's Pool, or Ratio Pool, this building's still there. My wife took this picture. Beautiful rock building. The problem is that Zane Grey wrote that they stayed in a log cabin. And there's no log cabin there. So what happened to the log cabin? I always figured that the cowboys tore the log cabin down to build the corral next to it. But we could never confirm it until Alan Pratt sent me this picture. And if you looked, that's kind of dim, you can kind of barely see it, but on the side of that picture, there's a log cabin. So that confirms what we thought. And in his diary, Zane Grey says they left the lower pool the next day, and there's two pools at Jacob's Pools, one up by the cliffs where the spring comes out, and then they pipe the water down to the lower pool. And then when they left, Zane Grey wanted to get out as quickly as possible. He didn't want to have to go all the way back to Lee's Ferry and across the desert. So they said Lawson came to our help, however, with the information that an occasional prospector or horse hunter crossed the canyon from the saddle, that would be the Moab Saddle, where a trail led down to the river. I've heard the trail's a bad one, said Lawson, and though I could never see it, I reckon it could be found. So Lawson and Onstadt led Zane Grey down a trail. And that's the North Bass Trail. And that's them. Zane Grey would have taken that picture. So that's a very good picture as well. And I think that one has been published. 1908 was a little bit different. By then, they decided you needed hunting licenses. But they didn't know how to really issue a hunting license. So he had to go into Kanab to get a hunting license, and it took him 5 days to get that hunting license. And so he kind of met people. He met Edie Woolley again, because Woolley had invited him to come and see his young daughters. So he certainly met her, and we know they do because the lady in the middle is one of Woolley's daughters, who's married to a gentleman named Thomas Chamberlain, who was immediately to her left. And in her own biography, Handmaiden to the Lord, she writes that Zane Grey did visit. He would have met Emma, who is Woolley's wife, because she cooked the dinner and everybody loved her dinner. And then on the far right, and I won't say much right now, but Eleanor McAllister ran the local Cole Hotel. And that's where he stayed. We know that he stayed there. Zane Grey's son told us he stayed there. There's an old hermit that lived there for many years that said that he stayed in the room where Zane Grey had written, and we're comfortable that he actually stayed there. She was a polygamist, by the way, as well. Some people say he only met one polygamist on the trip, Woolley. Oh, he met at least a dozen polygamists. And then he spent 2 days in Kanab, and then he went to Fredonia. Well, that's a pretty nice portrait of Jimmy Owens. It's taken really right at the time that he left, I think just after he left. But he had a home in Fredonia, so he may have wanted to go home. The gentleman on the right is a Stella Pratt Jackson, and I'm going to talk to her in just a second. I want to talk for just a minute about the gentleman in the middle, Ira Heaton, because he's fairly important. His family history, most people say that there were places that Zane Grey did not have time to visit. He was only there 5 days. Ira Heaton was from Long Valley, the area where Alton is, but during 1907 and 1908, he was living in Fredonia, and he was a carpenter. And what he was doing there, he was riding out to Pipe Springs and to Moccasin, where his family lived, doing repairs, building new buildings. And their family history and his biographical sketches, they don't say much. They don't say when. They don't say much at all other than that, yeah, I took Zane Grey on a horse ride and showed him the area. Did they go out to that area? We don't know. Now let's talk a little bit about Stella. The bigger picture with the children is taken by her father's house in Fredonia. Those are obviously her children, maybe her husband in the background, but that picture was taken the year before Zane Grey was there, so that's what she looked like, and you can see from the picture that she was fairly attractive. She was the same age as Zane Grey, so Zane Grey would have been about 35 then. But she told her children that she had been managing the Travelers Inn, the hotel at that time in Fredonia, and that Zane Grey had stayed there, and that at least a couple of nights they'd sat there talking about the Mormons. And then she, in her son's biographical sketch, her son says she told him, I guess I was the inspiration for his heroine in Riders of the Purple Sage. Well, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. Some of the places, this is the Cole Hotel, which is now the Purple Sage Inn here in town. It's a wonderful restoration and place to stay if you ever need to. It's over by the post office. It was called the Cole Hotel in those days. Interestingly, in Heritage of the Desert, there's a guy named Martin Cole, and he stays, and the hero stays there while he's recuperating for one night. The picture on the left of the home is the Stuart Woolley home, and that's the home that E.D. Woolley Jr. would have had Zane Grey have dinner with him at. To the right is what's now the Rocking V Cafe. I hope you've had an opportunity to have dinner there at some time. It's wonderful as well. Woolley and his son-in-law, Thomas Chamberlain Jr., owned that facility. It's where they would have got, Zane Grey's party would have got all their supplies to go up on the North Rim. This is a picture, as I mentioned, at the Travelers Inn. It was in Fredonia. The owner at the time that I visited said that she had been told by the previous owner that there were little cabins on the outside of the old Travelers Inn and that he stayed in one of those cabins. Again, word of mouth. I talked about Pipe Springs. What's interesting, if you look at this, the picture below is from their opera. And you can see that these people fighting over on the right, or no, the girl and the gentleman, that's Lassiter, and Jane Withersteen, the heroine, are in front of a replica of Pipe Springs. In the novel, Riders of the Purple Sage, Jane Withersteen's home is described as a fort-like structure with the big wooden doors and a spring going underneath it, several ponds below it. I don't think many people deny that that was most likely the inspiration, although we don't know whether Zane Grey got that information from E.D. Woolley and Estella Pratt, or whether Ira Heaton actually took her out there. Oh, the reason, by the way, that E.D. Woolley would know a lot about that is he had two wives, and he kept one of the wives out there at Pipe Springs. She called it the breeding ground. That's where they sent the wives to have babies, and it was across the border so the federal agents wouldn't bother them in Arizona. This is the big house in Moccasin, which is just right below. There's a gentleman named Brant Collier in Riders of Purple Sage who has a home just a couple miles away from Jane Withersteen's home. That's the big house, and we believe that this home was the inspiration. Ira Heaton's parents, Jonathan and, oh, I'm sorry if anyone knows, Lucy, lived there, and later, in a memorial to their mother, her daughters wrote that Zane Grey had visited there. Again, no time, no date, but supposedly he went there. Now, 1908 was almost identical to 1907. Zane Grey went with people up on the North Rim and lassoed a bunch of mountain lions. The people this time are slightly different, but not a lot. Zane Grey, Jim Emett. Jim Emett was not on the first trip because he took that young girl in the buckboard back to really to St. George, and also his father had died during his trial, and he lived in Fredonia, and he needed to go help his mother put his things in order, but he wanted to go. So in 1908, he was in the group that went on the trip. Of course, Buffalo Jones was there. Jimmy Owens was there again. This time their wrangler was a Native American gentleman called Navi. We're not sure if he was Navajo or Paiute, even though he's called Navi. But he didn't like mountain lions. He was scared to death of them and was truthfully pretty mistreated by the others in the party. Just a couple of places. We know that Zane Grey stopped by Coconina, the Coconina mine, which is Ryan now, because he wanted to see the electric lights, one of the only places in Arizona that had electric lights at the time. There's probably other attractions for Zane Grey down there. And then this is a picture, and some of you may be able to help me. This is Jimmy Owens' hunting camp in 1908. And I believe that that's Swamp Point in back of them. I don't know for sure, but I believe that that's the Moab Saddle in the camping in 1908. And then they came back the same way. This time it was Jim Emett that guided them, but they went down the Northwest Trail and out that direction. Just a couple of brief notes and I'll wrap up here. Zane Grey was inspired by the people who were there, the people he visited, the places that he went. They inspired people in his novels his entire time. For example, in Heritage of the Desert, Jim Emett was the Mormon patriarch August Nab. Emma Emmet was Mother Mary. Snap Emmet was Snap Nab. Maud Dodge Emmet, we believe, was Mescal. And Dave Rust, he told Dave Rust in a letter that he was the inspiration for Dave Nab, one of August Nab's sons. Places, we're not sure about this, but it appears that Kanab was who he referred to as White Sage. Lonely Dell, he called the Oasis. The Cole Hotel, he called Martin Cole's house. Thunder River was Thunder River, and he called the Vermilion Cliffs the Red Wall. In the Rise of Purple Sage, we've talked about Estella Jackson being the inspiration for Jane Witherstein, the inspiration in that novel. And we have one member who has done a lot of research and believes that Jimmy Owens was the inspiration for Jim Laster, the gunman of that novel. What Zen Irwin, our researcher who believes that, said is that he, Jimmy Owens, may have been Gray's model for all Texans in his Western romances. So did Owens provide Gray the model for his most enduring hero, Lassiter? Almost certain he did. And that's from Zen's paper on this. Places in Rise of Purple Sage, Pipe Springs was the Witherstein house. The big house, we believe, was Grant Collier's home. Thunder River. There was a river that came in Rise of the Purple Sage that comes out of the mountain and you can go under it. So we believe it was the inspiration for the Outlaw Den, which had a river and a waterfall like that. And Surprise Valley, we believe the initial inspiration for Surprise Valley was the Surprise Valley up in the North Rim, which he visited. Although later, he found another Surprise Valley over at the Four Corners area. Rainbow Trail. Now I'm going to pass through this other than to say that, again, the people he met were the inspiration for that. I do want to mention, though, Thomas Chamberlain Jr. In the novel, there's a character, a bad guy, who is harassing the young heroine. He may or may not have had a child by her. It depends on which version you read. But they said that he's some pumpkins. This is from the novel. Wagoner, that's the name of the character, has 5 wives and 55 children. Well, at the time Zane Grey was in Kanab, 1 wife had died. So he did have 5 wives and 55 children. No one else had anyone like that. So we're comfortable that that was who that was. And therefore, I think, although it may have been Maud Emmet again, we believe that his wife, Mary Chamberlain, who was his last wife, his 6th wife, may have been the inspiration for the young lady there. Those novels launched his career. In 1907 and 1908, there are 8 other books that are listed here that were all inspired by people and places from that time. So thank you. I say questions. No, you can't have any questions. You can talk to me later. This is the people of Zane Grey with one of his cougars. Thank you.